Chapter 4. In Curzon Street. The Honorable Mrs. Derek Kettering lived in Curzon Street. The butler who opened the door recognized Rufus Van Aldine at once and permitted himself a discreet smile of greeting. He led the way upstairs to the big double drawing room on the first floor. A woman who was sitting by the window started up with a cry.
"Why, Dad, if that isn't too good for anything. I've been telephoning Major Knighton all day to try and get hold of you, but he couldn't say for sure when you were expected back."
Ruth Kettering was 28 years of age. Without being beautiful, or in the real sense of the word even pretty, she was striking looking because of her coloring. Van Aldine had been called carrots and ginger in his time, and Ruth's hair was almost pure auburn. With it went dark eyes and very black lashes, the effect somewhat enhanced by art. She was tall and slender, and moved well. At a careless glance it was the face of a Raphael Madonna. Only if one looked closely did one perceive the same line of jaw and chin as in Van Aldine's face, bespeaking the same hardness and determination. It suited the man, but suited the woman less well. From her childhood upward Ruth Van Aldine had been accustomed to having her own way, and anyone who had ever stood up against her soon realized that Rufus Van Aldine's daughter never gave in.
"Knighton told me you'd phoned him,"
said Van Aldine.
"I only got back from Paris half an hour ago. What's all this about, Derek?"
Ruth Kettering flushed angrily.
"It's unspeakable. It's beyond all limits,"
she cried.
He doesn't seem to listen to anything I say."
There was bewilderment as well as anger in her voice.
"He'll listen to me,"
said the millionaire grimly. Ruth went on.
"I've hardly seen him for the last month. He goes about everywhere with that woman."
"With what woman?"
"Morel. She dances at the Parthenon, you know."
Van Aldine nodded.
"I was down at Leconbury last week. I spoke to Lord Leconbury. He was awfully sweet to me, sympathized entirely. He said he'd give Derek a good talking to."
"Oh,"
said Van Aldine.
"What do you mean by, Dad?"
"Just what you think I mean, Ruthie. Poor old Leconbury is a washout. Of course he sympathized with you. Of course he tried to soothe you down. Having got his son and heir married to the daughter of one of the richest men in the States, he naturally doesn't want to mess the thing up. But he's got one foot in the grave already. Everyone knows that. Anything he may say will cut darned little ice with Derek."
"Can't you do anything, Dad?"
urged Ruth, after a minute or two.
"I might,"
said the millionaire. He waited a second reflectively, and then went on.
"There are several things I might do, but there's only one that will be any real good. How much pluck have you got, Ruthie?"
She stared at him. He nodded back at her.
"I mean just what I say. Have you got the grit to admit to all the world that you've made a mistake? There's only one way out of this mess, Ruthie. Cut your losses and start afresh."
"You mean
"Divorce."
divorce?"
Van Aldine smiled drily.
You say that word, Ruth, as though you'd never heard it before. And yet your friends are doing it all around you every day.
"Oh, I know that. But..."
She stopped, biting her lip. Her father nodded comprehendingly.
"I know, Ruth. You're like me. You can't bear to let go. But I've learned, and you've got to learn, that there are times when it's the only way. I might find ways of whistling Derek back to you, but it would all come to the same in the end. He's no good, Ruth. He's rotten through and through. And mind you, I blame myself for ever letting you marry him. But you were kind of set on having him, and he seemed in earnest about turning over a new leaf, and well, I'd crossed you once, honey."
He did not look at her as he said the last words. Had he done so, he might have seen the swift color that came up in her face.
"You did,"
she said in a hard voice.
"I was too darn soft-hearted to do it a second time. I can't tell you how I wish I had, though. You've led a poor kind of life for the last few years, Ruth."
"It has not been very agreeable."
agreed Mrs. Kettering.
That's why I say to you that this thing has got to stop.
He brought his hand down with a bang on the table.
You may have a hankering after the fellow still. Cut it out. Face facts. Derek Kettering married you for your money. That's all there is to it. Get rid of him, Ruth.
Ruth Kettering looked down at the ground for some moments, then she said, without raising her head.
Supposing he doesn't consent?
Van Aldine looked at her in astonishment.
He won't have a say in the matter.
She flushed and bit her lip.
No, of course not. I only meant.
She stopped. Her father eyed her keenly.
What did you mean?
I meant.
She paused, choosing her words carefully.
He mayn't take it lying down.
The millionaire's chin shot out grimly.
You mean he'll fight the case? Let him. But, as a matter of fact, you're wrong. He won't fight. Any solicitor he consults will tell him he hasn't a leg to stand upon.
You don't think.
She hesitated.
I mean, out of sheer spite against me, he might, well, try to make it awkward.
Her father looked at her in some astonishment.
Fight the case, you mean?
He shook his head.
Very unlikely. You see, he would have to have something to go upon.
Mrs. Kettering did not answer. Van Aldine looked at her sharply.
Come, Ruth, out with it. There's something troubling you. What is it?
Nothing at all.
But her voice was unconvincing.
You are dreading the publicity. Eh? Is that it? You leave it to me. I'll put the whole thing through so smoothly that there will be no fuss at all.
Very well, Dad, if you really think it's the best thing to be done.
Got a fancy for the fellow still, Ruth? Is that it?
No.
The word came with no uncertain emphasis. Van Aldine seemed satisfied. He patted his daughter on the shoulder.
It will be all right, little girl. Don't you worry any. Now let's forget about all this. I have brought you a present from Paris.
For me? Something very nice?
I hope you'll think so,
said Van Aldine, smiling. He took the parcel from his coat pocket and handed it to her. She unwrapped it eagerly and snapped open the case. A long-drawn "oh" came from her lips. Ruth Kettering loved jewels, always had done so.
Dad, how wonderful!
Rather in a class by themselves, aren't they?
Said the millionaire with satisfaction.
You like them, eh?
Like them? Dad, they're unique. How did you get hold of them?
Van Aldine smiled.
Oh, that's my secret. They had to be bought privately, of course. They are rather well known. See that big stone in the middle? You have heard of it, maybe that's the historic Heart of Fire.
Heart of Fire!
Repeated Mrs. Kettering. She had taken the stones from the case and was holding them against her breast. The millionaire watched her. He was thinking of the series of women who had worn the jewels. The heartaches, the despairs, the jealousies. Heart of Fire, like all famous stones, had left behind it a trail of tragedy and violence. Held in Ruth Kettering's assured hand, it seemed to lose its potency of evil. With her cool, equable poise, this woman of the Western world seemed a negation to tragedy or heartburnings. Ruth returned the stones to their case, then, jumping up, she flung her arms round her father's neck.
Thank you, Dad. They are wonderful. You do give me the most marvelous presents always.
That's all right,
said Van Aldine, patting her shoulder.
You are all I have, Ruthie.
You will stay to dinner, won't you, Father?
I don't think so. You were going out, weren't you?
Yes, but I can easily put that off. Nothing very exciting.
No,
said Van Aldine.
Keep your engagement. I've got a good deal to attend to. See you tomorrow, my dear. Perhaps if I phone you, we can meet at Galbraith's.
Messrs. Galbraith, Cuthbertson and Galbraith were Van Aldine's London solicitors.
Very well, Dad.
She hesitated.
I suppose this won't keep me from going to the Riviera?
When are you off?
On the 14th.
Oh, that will be all right. These things take a long time to mature. By the way, Ruth, I shouldn't take those rubies abroad if I were you. Leave them at the bank.
Mrs. Kettering nodded.
We don't want to have you robbed and murdered for the sake of Heart of Fire,
said the millionaire jocosely.
And yet you carried it about in your pocket loose,
retorted his daughter, smiling.
Yes.
Some hesitation, caught her attention.
What is it, Dad?
Nothing.
He smiled.
Thinking of a little adventure of mine in Paris.
An adventure?
Yes, the night I bought these things.
He made a gesture towards the jewel case.
Oh, do tell me.
Nothing to tell, Ruthie. Some Apache fellows got a bit fresh and I shot at them and they got off. That's all.
She looked at him with some pride.
You're a tough proposition, Dad.
You bet I am, Ruthie.
He kissed her affectionately and departed. On arriving back at the Savoy, he gave a curt order to Knighton.
Get hold of a man called Goby. You'll find his address in my private book. He's to be here tomorrow morning at 9:30.
Yes, sir.
I also want to see Mr. Kettering. Run him to earth for me if you can. Try his club. At any rate, get hold of him somehow and arrange for me to see him here tomorrow morning. Better make it late-ish, about 12. His sort aren't early risers.
The secretary nodded in comprehension of these instructions. Van Aldine gave himself into the hands of his valet. His bath was prepared, and as he lay luxuriating in the hot water, his mind went back over the conversation with his daughter. On the whole, he was well satisfied. His keen mind had long since accepted the fact that divorce was the only possible way out. Ruth had agreed to the proposed solution with more readiness than he had hoped for. Yet, in spite of her acquiescence, he was left with a vague sense of uneasiness. Something about her manner, he felt, had not been quite natural. He frowned to himself.
Maybe I'm fanciful.
He muttered.
And yet, I bet there's something she has not told me.